Ladies and gentlemen, this is Monarch and Moreau, and this channel is dedicated to funeral professionals who, although they don't have the lowest price, they wouldn't mind making the most money. That's what our training is about, increasing your power at the bargaining table, where the rubber meets the road at the point of sale. Type of training videos, consider following us. We're going to be dropping one of these videos at least once per week. I just want to be real clear what the value proposition is here at Monarch and Moreau. We help you increase your bargaining power at the point of sale, at the bargaining table. Bargaining power comes from a distinct value proposition that's validated where the rubber meets the road at the point of sale, at the bargaining table. But it's detracted from when it's undermined at the bargaining table instead. If we're going to help buyers get past their hesitation in buying, we have to help our staff get past their hesitation in selling. And hesitation in selling arises when we're inadequately trained. If we hesitate selling, buyers are going to hesitate buying. It's as simple as that. And our staff is hesitating because we've been neglecting to address a very insidious issue, one that you might not even be aware of. But funeral sales, hospice sales are not like other sales. They happen at the intersection of caregiving and commercial interests. On the one hand, professionals are deeply responsible for the care they deliver families. On the other hand, they're highly accountable for the revenue they generate for their employer. If your location, if your career is going to flourish at this intersection, caregiving, commercial interests, you have to be able to balance the two. And if we're juggling, we can't balance, it's going to affect our work-life balance, not just our sales. We're going to hesitate both in our professional life, but also in our personal life, right? It's going to strain our relationships with other people, push us towards social isolation, and really diminish the quality of our life. Do you think, just based on what we're talking about, that to flourish at this intersection of caregiving and commercial interests, we're going to need to train for a diverse skill set? What do you think? What do you think we're going to find? First of all, what is emotional labor? Emotional labor is when you're required as part of your job to express some level of emotions, emotional care, some type of corresponding, congruent emotional pattern. You're at a funeral with the solemn and somber, the bereaved, you're going to behave a certain way. You might not feel like behaving that way. It can cause some emotional disconnect. You might not really act genuinely. You might just pretextually pretend to care that day, because some days we care more than others. So that's emotional labor. That takes a toll because over time you stop to grasp the difference between the two. Real genuine emotion is, purported pretextual emotion that I'm required to give as part of my job. And here's the thing, it's insidious, right? It goes unrecognized, unnoticed, undiagnosed. You don't even know this is happening to you, but it builds up and it affects your performance. You wonder why you're not enthused, you're burnt out, you kind of have emotional fatigue. So the funeral ends and you go back to your office and the phone rings. So before you can fully recover from being disingenuine to the Johnsons because you really weren't feeling it today, but they had a visitation, you attended and you put on the smiley face, you put on the show. And so now your actions and the way you really feel don't match up. So you're feeling a certain way. The phone rings and you need to make a sale. You need to make an upsell.
Hello?
You need to command a premium price. You see the conflict between delivering care, the emotional labor required, the toll that can take on you if you're not conditioned, you're not prepared, you're not trained to balance it, and then the commercial interests of hitting the sales quota. So, question for you, you've got all that going on. What would The Rock say? What would he say to us? He'd say,
"Can you smell what The Rock is cooking?"
this is a recipe for disaster, isn't it? But these are the working conditions, right? So we got to be prepared for them. What happens when we're not prepared for them? So if you're struggling with any of these things we're talking about in this video, or your staff is struggling with these things, then you're at a higher risk of not only quitting your job, but quitting the industry altogether. People are leaving the industry because they're burnt out, they have low job satisfaction, they feel emotionally exhausted, and because they have to be disingenuous because of that required emotional labor, and then those commercial interests, they're having trouble really balancing that. It's caused them to kind of disassociate and really depersonalize themselves from their craft. Because this conflict, right, our inability to juggle this, really reconcile what we know to be morally and ethically right, and maybe what we're being asked to do because we don't know the value behind our prices. So this commercial interest, this sales quota seems really misaligned with our goals. But then when we interact with families, our emotions often feel misaligned with, just how we act. And this creates something called moral distress, and it creates a real ethical dilemma where you struggle to continue. You have to be willing to continue to compete for the sale, continue to try to upsell, close the prospect. You have to persist in your sales efforts. Do that if you're struggling with moral conflict, right? If you're struggling with ethical dilemmas. When that happens, we're not going to sell, we're going to hesitate. And that hesitation is going to be transferred because it's contagious. Just like mental ownership can be transferred, it's contagious. Just like our attitudes can be transferred, they're contagious. And our fellow staff members can be infected. And so, would you believe that when you're not trained and prepared to give this huge quantity of emotional labor, you're not prepared for that? You start to accumulate emotional fatigue. You start to come closer and closer to burnout. And as you do, your attitude decreases more and more. And believe it or not, your coworkers, they feel it more and more, and it increases the potential for conflict. I'm going to say it again. Do you smell
What the rock is cooking?
We're talking about on this channel bargaining power, selling at top dollar funeral sales. How to get them, how to get more of them, how to get them easier than ever before. We got to take the brakes off. Got to take the brakes off you and your staff. These self-limiting factors that have gone on unaddressed for years, causing real psychological and health issues. This stuff builds up, it accumulates, it wears down you and your staff. So if this is you or someone you know, you're going to hesitate. You're not going to upsell, you're going to hesitate. You're going to hesitate just to sell. It'll be difficult under these conditions to do more than just take a customer's order. To flesh that out for you, I think it would help if we just looked at what it actually takes to be successful at sales and look at 3 possibilities. So we've got our underachievers, right? These are the apathetic people who maybe are burnt out and they don't compete anymore. They just don't care. Then we have the people in the middle that aren't super achievers, but they're fairly confident they can definitely take the order. They're not going to lose the sale, but they might not proactively fight for the sale either. And then we have our top performers, our above average achievers. So you got the people who don't try. Maybe they're burnt out. Maybe they're demoralized. They're avoiding pain, right? They're looking to avoid discomfort. They've got low confidence. They've got a real passive, indifferent, very apathetic disposition towards sales, towards your brand in general. They're not trying to argue with customers, right? They're not going to handle objections or concerns. They're not going to compete for you. Most of the time, they don't even ask for the close. They're just very reactive, not proactive in any meaningful way. Then we got those that try a little bit harder, right? They sell on price. They feel like they sell at a fair price. They follow the same script every time. They make that low ball offer. They're really adverse to risk. They don't want to lose the sale. They're definitely not going to upsell or sell at a premium price. They'll answer a few concerns. They're not going to stay in there and argue, right? And they'll ask for the business, but they're not going to overdo it. And then you've got the successful person who believes in their service so much, got such an abundance of inner sold wherewithal to sell from, that all they do is transfer mental ownership all day long, right? They've got high confidence. They're highly efficient. They think strategically, and they're very resilient, very persistent. They're going to stay in there, stay on the phone. They're not going to hesitate. They're going to answer 3, 4, 5 objections and concerns. They're going to reframe, right? They're going to come back, ask for the close multiple times, 5, 6, 7 times. How many times do you ask for the sale? When's the last time you asked for the sale 4, 5, 6 times? And they make decisions. Now I'm talking about the high achievers, the ones who are sold themselves. They make these decisions easy because they transfer that inner certainty from that inner wherewithal of self-sold, and they're superstars because of it. Who smells
What the rock is cooking here?
Listen, when you compete for sales, you win sales. When you don't compete, you lose sales. When you're not competing, you're trying 2 or 3 times, whereas those who are really competing try as many times as it takes because they really believe what they're doing. They don't have that moral conflict, right? They've got it balanced out. They're prepared and confident. That's where you need to be if you're going to sell at a high price. Because if you're not there, you're going to struggle just to get sales. You can't make this type of effort when you're dealing with that level of cognitive strain, that level of anxiety, right? That level of depersonalization, feeling like an imposter. When you're unsure, you're uncertain, you can't bring forth that type of effort. You're emotionally exhausted. You feel like you're nearing burnout. And you're going to have that insidious source that causes all of these problems if you or your staff can't answer these questions. Why should the prospect pay more for us? Why should they decide now? Why should they choose our service variation? Why our company? Why our brand? Why me personally? And why not the competition? When you can't answer those powerfully and persuasively, first to yourself, you're going to struggle. You're not going to sell at a premium price. You're going to struggle just to sell, period. So we got to overcome this if we're going to sell and then sell at a high price, because this is a real dilemma with real consequences. And you're not immune to it. So even though at first thought you might think, well, this isn't me, pay attention to how this manifests, right? And ask yourself, could this be me? Is this somebody I know? Selling power comes from self-certainty, born of that inner wherewithal of self-soul. So we looked at what emotional labor is, what it does to you, the demands it places on you. Let's start looking at some of the consequences of having to give that emotional labor, right? Having to, even when we're not feeling happy, maybe put the smile on and comfort the bereaved when maybe we need to be comforted. Moral injury can occur anytime someone feels like they're either perpetuating, failing to prevent, or just bearing witness to an act that transgresses their moral beliefs. And when professionals in death care, in end of life care, feel like they might be exploiting vulnerable individuals just to meet sales quotas, it can cause a moral injury. Remember, we want to compete. We want our staff to compete for sales, compete for premium prices. If we feel like we're exploiting vulnerable people for financial gain, we might operate with a sense of guilt, might cause some intrusive thoughts, and the symptoms to this might be closer to PTSD. And that's not a good sales environment, is it? Can you see where that could possibly, potentially lead to burnout? Because sometimes we have to be compassionate and caring when we can't do so genuinely. Don't feel like giving compassionate care, but you do anyway. That creates an emotional debt. That's emotional labor. Very expensive. And that disingenuous acting, the pretextual compassion that we have to show, that emotional labor that has to happen for you to give care. As we're going through this, ask yourself, this year, this summer, compared to last year, last summer, what's my fatigue level like? How irritable am I? Am I detaching or am I engaging more, right? Do I feel a greater or a less sense of work accomplishment? Am I closer to joy and happiness, or do I feel like I might be trending toward depression? These are the signs of burnout. Let's take a time out. Let me ask you two things, owners, managers, funeral directors, right, whose income and paycheck is dependent to this to some extent, right? When the call comes in, we can sell at a competitive price, right? We could sell at a discount. We could upsell at a premium price, or we could just lose the sale. Isn't that right? And do you believe that we're somewhere in the spectrum from peak performance and high job satisfaction and then burnout on the other end of the spectrum? And our performance might be impacted on which side of the spectrum we're closer to. Now, we have to be clear in our value propositions and certain in our delivery. But if we're struggling reconciling two contradictory issues, commercial interests and caregiving, then we might develop something called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is going to create stress, anxiety, even depression in you and your staff when you struggle with the dissonance between your role as a caregiver and then your pressure that you have, whether it's self-imposed or whether it's from management, but the pressure you have to be a salesperson and hit sales quotas. And we talked about attitudes being contagious, right? So the funeral professional really has to be resilient, right? Because compassion fatigue is where you've taken on so much emotional residue and additional strain just from your exposure to grieving families, people suffering, that you're starting to feel that way. And that's only going to get exasperated if you have additional stresses meeting sales targets that you don't feel prepared for. Talking about emotional residue, right? It builds up. This stuff wears you down gradually. It's insidious. Compassion fatigue is just like that. It's known as secondary traumatic stress. And you get it when you've been working with people who are bereaved, who are grieving, who are going through it. Over time, it reduces your capacity to be empathetic. And it just reduces your ability to bond, connect, and meaningfully engage with other people, whether they're clients, even your family members can be impacted. When you've put a lot of emotional labor in and you've got that emotional residue, that secondary trauma stress, you're starting to develop some severe compassion fatigue. You're just not as empathetic as you used to be. You're starting to count all the times, all the funerals you were maybe less than genuine because, again, you had to make that emotional labor. You had to put that effort in to comfort the bereaved, even when you didn't feel like it. Over time, this can develop into something called imposter syndrome, where people just start to feel like maybe they really are a fraud. Imposter syndrome carries with it chronic anxiety, low self-esteem, and just general feelings of being inadequate. If you're feeling like that, are you charging a premium price for your services? If your staff is feeling like that, are they telling you? And like I said, when these things clash, right, when you've got that role conflict, you're a caregiver, but now you've got to meet this commercial interest, this sales quota, you've got that conflict, you're worn down, close to burnout, you're going to default to whatever aligns more with your moral compass, the path of least pain. So you'll become hyper caregiver, apathetic seller. And then think back to our underachiever, average professional, then our sales superstar. Who's going to get in there and fight for you? Who's going to get in there, do the rebuttals, resolve the concerns? Who's going to get in there and ask for the close 3, 4, 5 times? Who's going to get in there and start an anchor high? Who's going to go in there and either lowball, discount, or even ask for the sale at all? probably the person who's going to depersonalize, right? That's a defense mechanism at this point. They're so close to just being burnt out, and the pressure to sell is some individuals are just going to emotionally detach altogether. They're going to become completely apathetic towards your brand, towards selling, and they're going to start even coming to work less. And then you've got the people who will burn themselves out. They will literally work themselves to death. They will burn the candle from both ends. Sometimes you get undercover imposter syndrome where you just haven't dealt with it. You haven't had that conversation with yourself. You haven't reflected on the fact that you feel a little bit like an imposter, but you're going to work through it. You're going to make sure that that's not you. They're determined. These are determined people that are not trained, do not have the right coping skills to deal with the vast amount of emotional labor that's required from them. It overwhelms them, starts to break them down, but they combat it, they cope with it by trying to be perfectionists, right? And that causes a lot of anxiety. And eventually it crashes. And so the catch 22 for you, though, is the compounding nature of this because although you defer to caregiving, you would also like to hit your sales goal employees. So it creates even further conflict because you are such a hard worker. You are a perfectionist. So achieving things is important to you. Our professional lives matter. It's a big part of who we are. It's how we feed our family. And it matters how people think of us, and it matters how we think about ourselves. And if there's a lot of conflict, a lot of moral dilemmas, a lot of unanswered questions, if we're struggling with cognitive dissonance and we're feeling very close to burnt out, we're very emotionally exhausted, irritable, we're having trouble coping, trying to hit sales quotas is just going to make things worse. And if we don't hit it, we might feel ashamed. And if we do hit it, we might feel ashamed. You see how that can mess with our whole identity, let alone be able to sell at premium prices? Funeral professional, you can't live a fragmented life. You don't deserve that. You don't deserve to be a great funeral director and a poor salesperson. You don't settle for that. You're 100% good. Because champions do what competitors won't do. To be a champion, you have to stand up, be accountable, and say, I can change this. When the call comes in, I can sell at a competitive price. I can discount the price to try to get the sale. I can try to upsell, sell at a premium price, or I can just lose the sale. But if I can answer these questions right here and make the most important sale, the sale to myself, I can avoid all the problems that is holding me back, and I can release the brakes and have the breakthrough that I deserve in my professional career, so that I can have that power at the bargaining table. You better than anyone in the industry 7 sometimes. And I want to tell you right now, you're not disingenuous. It's just make a fist, squeeze as hard as you can, and try to do it forever, right? You won't even be able to do it for an hour. You're going to have to relax. You're going to have to let go. Dualistic existence. You can't be compassionate and caring 24/7. There's no way for you to do that. So you don't have to feel bad about that, but the facts are sometimes you will. So if you want my notes to this, just go to the blog and download them. Again, I don't ask for anybody's email, but if you want to talk about this, have a sales intervention, just get a hold of me. Remember that sales training isn't just about persuasive power. Being able to have power at the bargaining table, at the point of sale, where the rubber meets the road, where your value proposition is either going to be validated or undermined, has a lot to do with resiliency. Sales strength makes you resilient. You have that inner wherewithal of self-sold. It's going to inoculate you from some of these challenges that we talked about in this video. Remember, when the call comes in, I can sell at a competitive price. I can discount the price to try to get the sale. I can try to upsell, sell at a premium price, or I can just lose the sale. There's more about that on my blog. Go check it out. Spencer, this is Monarch and Moreau. In this video, I'm going to talk about selling at premium prices. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Monarch and Moreau. And this channel is dedicated to funeral professionals who, although they don't have the lowest price, they wouldn't mind making the most money. That's what our training is about. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Monarch and Moreau.